Hello and welcome to our Design Talks panel for today for Brisbane Open House. This panel is called Large Projects, Sports, Transport and Culture. I'm here to introduce the chair, Malcolm Middleton. Malcolm was appointed the Queensland Government Architect in July 2011 after almost 30 years in private practice. He provides project and policy advice and undertakes design reviews for projects across many areas of government, as well as chairing the Queensland Urban Design and Places Panel and Brisbane Open House. He contributes to many external panels, including the Prime Minister's official Residents Advisory Committee, the Development and Design Integrity Panel of the Brisbane Airport Corporation, and is an independent director of the Architects Accreditation Council of Australia, and many other appointments. Welcome, Malcolm.
And good afternoon, everybody here in the studio. Great to see some people here and online. So welcome to the larger projects discussion for Brisbane Open House. And this is one of a number of talks that we are doing this week. I think it's a really interesting topic. We'll be speaking about how large projects with the wow factor impact urban places, how they need special teams and planning and experience to work at that scale. And we'll be exploring broadly how larger projects impact communities, and you'll hear about some of the personal experiences on the way these impact cities, transport, cultural interaction, sports participation. But before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place in multiple locations, and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. Now, to introduce our panel of speakers, we really do have a very high quality group here today. Firstly, opening up, we have Keith Allen as a principal at Hassell, and Keith is a recognised leader in rail planning, design and delivery of railway projects. And Keith's had a hand in some of Australia's most significant transport developments. Currently, he's the director for the enormous Cross River Rail project here in Brisbane, and he's overseeing architecture, urban design and the landscape component of that job. He has complex, large-scale work experience, and it really does challenge him in both a creative design sense and being able to have big-picture thinking. He brings these skills together on these extraordinary projects by cleverly adapting the stations and precincts so they become part of the natural urban fabric of the city. Secondly, we have Daniel Tobin, and we're lucky to have Daniel. He's on his way to go and live in New York. He's a founder and creative director of Urban Arts Projects, who have been a friend of Open House for a long time. Daniel works closely with the company's art and design teams across all studios and the workshops in Brisbane, Shanghai and New York. Throughout his 27 years of practice, he's been instrumental in delivering key projects throughout Asia, the Middle East, North America and Australia. Most recently, Dan has spearheaded UAP's Project One Earth with the aim to become a future normal organisation, and we may get him to talk a little about that too. One that acts meaningfully in its surroundings, aims for 100% well-being and sees money as a means, not an end. And finally, we have Paul Henry. Paul is an internationally recognised expert in the design and master planning of stadia, racecourses, arenas and the planning of Olympic Games. He's an Australian architect with worldwide success and oversees all of Populous's projects in the Asia-Pacific region. Many of Paul's stadium designs have become a centrepiece for city development, as well as showcasing Australian skills and expertise. He was the director responsible for the design and delivery of all stages of Stadium Australia, and he's a member of the National Advisory Council of the Export Council of Australia, and is passionate about Australia exporting its services, knowledge and creative skills. So you can see we have a really experienced team, and interestingly, all locals, which I think is really says something about the status of Brisbane in a world setting. But when we talk about really large projects, these projects have a number of common themes, whether it's in art or sport or catching a train. They're very complex projects. they do require a lot of patience, and I can attest to that from my exposure to large projects. They've always got budget challenges. They're quite political, they're quite bureaucratic, and there's always a risk that the magic that you're trying to build can be whittled away over a long time period. So that's the challenge that we're here to explore today, and I thought we might open up by asking each of our panellists to say a little about the nature of their own practice in creating experiences, because ultimately these big projects are experiential for a lot of people. So Keith, perhaps you'd like to lead off and tell us how you do this.
Sure, thanks Malcolm, and I'm really glad you do refer to me as a local. I'm really encouraged by that, and you can tell from my accent that I am an adopted person into Brisbane. I've been here for probably 18 years now, so I certainly do consider myself as a local to the city. And you know, as you mentioned, my background is in transport, in station design and precincts, and how that actually integrates with the city. And Cross River Rail is a really phenomenal project, I think, in terms of a canvas that we can develop new experiences for Brisbane and actually redefine this city in the way it's perceived internationally, nationally, and also by the locals who live here and work every day. And you know, in terms of scale of project, for me, this is probably the most influential project that's actually happening in Australia at the moment, in terms of, you know, 4 major precincts within the CBD, a complete change in the way the city's going to be used, the way that Albert Street is going to be opened up to new public realm. We're pedestrianising that part of the city. Major regeneration around the GABA, and I know that there'll be a lot of conversation, I'm sure, around that emerging sports precinct. And again, you know, Roma Street, it's fantastic to see the transit centre coming down. It's nearly gone.
Here.
And, you know, the opportunity that's now actually going to open up in that part of the city, it really is phenomenal. In terms of, you know, our approach to experience, it's at the core of the way that we work. We certainly try to design our projects around an experience master plan, and we work with a number of collaborators around understanding how people use the city, how they actually want to use public transport, and how you encourage a new user base into these new parts of the city and into public transport.
Great, thanks. Paul?
Thanks, Malcolm. I think for a lot of our work, it involves large numbers of people. And so these are gathering places for large numbers of people. And what that means is there's lots of different experiences. And so our effort as designers is to try and curate those experiences and understand them from the time someone leaves home to the time they sit in their seat or go to an exhibition. And so that idea about designing from a journey is very important to us. We use the study of people as foundational in our work from an anthropology point of view, so that we really have a take on what people's desires are for one of these developments. These developments are so much more than about buildings. They're about public spaces, they're about a series of buildings, they're about an urban scale, and thinking about that in a way that resonates at a human scale is really the great challenge of them.
There's also a legacy component, isn't there? And I was talking to Paul just before we went on air about Suncorp Stadium, which of course is a favourite place for a lot of Queenslanders in many ways. And last night, of course, we had, in a strange time of the year, the State of Origin game, which was played in Adelaide, also a strange location, but a wonderful stadium, really exceptional backdrop there. The notion of there being a deciding game potentially at Suncorp was mentioned by a number of commentators as the place has this advantage for the home team. That experience is an interesting legacy experience that you've built into that.
Well, I think part of the aim for us in that was how do you enhance that atmosphere? That kind of cauldron effect of Lang Park was very precious. And so a lot of the efforts went into how do we give it that intensity? But it goes way beyond just the seat. And what's interesting about Lang Park and why I think it's resonated is the way it sits in that location from an urban design point and the way it connects, both from a pedestrian point of view, has had an impact around that entire area. And so I think none of these projects are an island. They're actually integrated into the surrounding areas, and the better we do that, the greater the legacy actually is for it. I think the other part was the idea of a sense of place. And so Lang Park was about its approach to climate, the unique Brisbane climate, the openness of that, the permeability of that. It was also an approach to the location. You know, across from the Ithaca Baths and the beautiful trees in that location was an important part of how the forecourts were all designed. And I think you have to marry all of those together to create that experience journey.
So Dan, we were talking also just before we came on, and you were referencing, in fact, at Suncorp, one of the artworks that certainly we all felt had stood the test of time. And I don't know that was one that you installed, was it?
No, it wasn't one of our projects, but it was an extraordinary piece of work called Shroud, I believe, and it was representing the cemetery that was on the site prior to the stadium being built. And it's lasted the test of time too, and it's beautifully integrated to the building. I can't recall the artist's name, but it's a delicate application onto the architecture itself, and very successful at sort of preserving memory of something that is now gone on the new stadium. And I think, to me, it's those connections to place that are so important in terms of public art and the space that we work in. It's, I find it very exciting to be wandering a city and exploring streets and discovering moments along that journey, whether it's a journey to go and get milk or whether you're going for a Sunday walk with a loved one. It's creating those very human moments and bringing the scale down. The city is huge in scale, bringing that scale down and creating intimate moments and creating memories for people is really important. I think Kabusia said that we are social animals, and I think cities are the space where we rub up against each other, and we like being in a crowd, and we like the activity that brings. Public art sort of reflects and reveals who we are, and those opportunities to sort of layer artists' thinking within the architecture of a city. It's a thrilling place to work and a great way to create an experience for the public.
Now, these projects that you're all talking to and have experienced, they all happen over long periods of time. Sometimes the activity is extremely intense, of course, and they're deadline-driven very often, particularly sports events. You can't, well, until this year, you couldn't move in Olympic Games. But the notion of continuity of engagement over time, I'd like to explore a bit with you. How do you go about identifying your own personal role to ensure that the things you think are important will be there right through? You want to lead on that, Keith?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, Malcolm. And, I think with Cross River Rail, I actually had my first conversation about that project over 10 years ago, more actually. 2006, we started doing some strategy work with state government around alignment options, how we actually solve the underlying transport problem with that project. And then we had a fantastic engaging period through 2009, 2010 with the state government when we developed the reference design. And, the key moves and outcomes that you see with the project were actually predetermined, that length of time ago, really 10 years ago. We were thinking about the experience of the city, how do you change that? How do you actually select an alignment through the city? Where you select a station location to actually bring those long-term economic benefits, but also completely change the dynamics. And then most recently into this phase, I think that we're now entering our 4th year in the delivery of the project. So the continuity of idea is really challenging to actually achieve through that period. We go through multiple tiers of reviews and tender period, then through a really challenging contractual closeout period. And at every move through that process, the ideas and the scope and the clarity is really getting challenged the whole time. And for us, it's actually critical that at the beginning of a design process, we've got absolute clarity in the idea, conceptual clarity around the architecture, how we integrate with the city, how that's carried through. We always need to distill it back to a simple diagram that you can always refer back to whenever those challenges are coming in, when the VE items are happening, whenever the...
VE being value engineering.
Correct. And I know that Paul might have a few comments on that later as well from an experience point of view, but having the clarity in the idea and the simplicity in your thinking is absolutely critical to carry through such a long gestation period for these projects.
Cool.
It's an interesting one, Malcolm. It's common for a lot of the projects to be like 10 to 15 years in gestation, and it is a tremendously long time. As long as there is clarity in what we're trying to achieve, what's the objective of the project, it will generally have a smoother pathway. But they are also of a point in time. Decisions are made on such large projects coming down to a very fine point in time. And so as designers, one of the things we have to do is to be ready for those points so that the clear, articulated ideas resonate throughout. So there's layers of story in the design, from the most simplistic through to the most sophisticated. And it needs to be there for everyone to be able to grab that. If someone else other than the architect tells the design story, that's a really powerful thing. And part of our job is to help that resonate through all parties. But I think the other thing on time is recognising that these are 50-year plus projects. And so we have to look ahead to say that not everything will be done on day one. And so these buildings evolve, these precincts evolve over a long period of time. And it's having the foresight and the bravery at all levels to say things will be different in 50 years to what they are now. So we do need to try and think ahead for how we can actually accommodate that over time. So I think the idea of time's critical in these projects, both in the lead up, the critical points of time to have it approved, but then the length of time that people will live with this project and how it can actually influence a city.
Dan, you are slightly at a different angle here with this, in that your project work is very often complementary rather than being the feature itself, although not always, and we can perhaps talk about Abu Dhabi project as that it is the place. But what's your feeling about this continuity question?
I suppose we get involved in all stages of a project. So we will do a public art master plan, a citywide public art master plan. We've just recently completed one for the city of Jeddah. So that's imagining a rollout of 1,000 commissions across the city over a long period of time.
1,000 commissions?
1,000, public art commissions from varying scales, from city gateways to small neighbourhood parks. So we set up strategies that have to lay out a plan of action for a series of consultants that would follow us. And we use the phrase preserving the creative intent, making sure that the essence of what you've dreamed up or what you want to put in place, what you want to see the end outcome, is secured and followed through at all stages. So setting up those master plans for then other public art consultants to sort of do strategies for small parts of that city, and then for artists to deliver the outcome on the ground. Ensuring a systematic process is there, but also the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions on the ground, or time elapsing from the master plan to, the final project might be done 20 or 30 years from now. So it's being strong in your original planning and allowing the process to happen.
So individually, when we started off this conversation proclaiming you all as locals, and you've all done major work, of course, and are doing major work here in this city, but you're also all working in other places. How important is it then to have the continuity of the local place as part of the team effort that you're all individually perhaps managing, directing, even creating, but having that local input? Perhaps, Dan, we'll continue with you a little.
Yeah, I think it's essential. Without it, you're just duplicating international style projects all over the world. And I think we've all been on projects like that where connection to place has not been as strong as it needs to be. I think in our space, in the public art space, we quite often come in at the end, towards the end of projects, and we're about delivering outcomes on the ground. So our projects always involve local curators, commissioning local artists. There might be a mix of international and local artists, but creating those very unique stories to place are important to connecting to community. If you don't have that, you don't have a strong sense of ownership by the people that are living locally. And therefore they don't embrace the project. There's no connection there.
So Paul, you've got your Kai Tak project in Hong Kong, which is a really gigantic site in a very, very dense city. How do you...
It's a wonderful challenge. I think there's an image of it here. One of the things that we had to do there was to be really clear about, we were trying to achieve connecting the residential areas back to the harbour. And so it was actually saying that we need to cut right through the middle of the project with an avenue, which is what we did. There was original reference design done, and the challenge here was these are very big buildings, and there was a lot of them on the site. To try and give it some clarity, we needed some ideas that resonated locally. What was it about that local context? And two things there were very obvious. One was the harbour, so that when we designed the stadium, you're sitting in the stadium, we have a glass window at the end that's about 70 metres long by about 25 metres high, so everyone can see the harbour when they're sitting in the stadium. And that's also so the TV cameras can see that as well, so you create a sense of place. But importantly, the idea of the surrounding areas being integrated into all of the parts of the development and to the actual harbour. The other lovely thing, and it kind of picks up what we were just talking about, is the history of the site was the old airport.
Yeah.
And so there were so many great references for what that airport meant to Hong Kong as a city, and we picked up on a lot of those in the aspects of the design, including the desire to actually have the project achieve things for their elite athletes and their future of sport in the city and participation of people within sport. So there were broader community objectives to achieve in the project that we picked up in lots of different layers and levels.
And Keith made the point earlier about game-changing 4 major precincts in Brisbane and in the Cross River Rail. When you think about it, yes, you've got Dutton Park and Wollongabba and Roma Street and Albert Street. That's a big change to the city. Your Hong Kong project, that airport was, of course, off limits and suddenly becomes a place for completely different land use of a scale that most people can't really contemplate. So how do you go about getting what is important for the locals?
I think there's several layers to that. One, the idea of scale, as you say, is super important. And when you look at the Hong Kong site, the avenue we carved is about 1 kilometre long through the middle of it. What was also interesting about that project, because they're normally international design competitions. And so we get to see, once we've won the project, you see the other projects and how other folks actually approached it. And I was really amazed that most of the other teams approached the buildings as objects, whereas our approach was quite different to that, was to design a series of experiences. And many of the buildings are actually edge conditions. They're not really about creating an object. They're about that kind of edge condition of permeability and how you actually engage with the buildings. And so I think that idea of resonating with local community also came from a really clear understanding of the movement patterns. The sites are so big that there is actually movement patterns that will occur from residential to trains, residential to harbours. There's layers of those circulations that occur, and embedding those throughout the project, I think, creates a canvas for people to actually live there, and that's one of the key parts for it.
Keith, how do you go about the 4 different precincts here? Do you have 4 different design approaches, or is it a family of forms that complement the city but still respect the individual place?
I mean, it's obviously a big challenge for metro projects, and what we're actually doing in Brisbane at the moment, where we've probably only got 5% of the project is actually above ground, and the other 95% is subterranean. So there's a number of quite different and unique experiences and references back to place that you need to make on a project of that scale and complexity. And there's an image that might come up on the screen in a second about creating places for Brisbane. And, this was really one of our core conceptual ideas around how the project manifests itself above ground. And the sketch on the left-hand side of people sitting under a tree, we were actually walking around the city one day and looking at Albert Street, and there was this amazing photograph that we seen of a couple of uni students sitting under a tree in Botanic Gardens, reading a book and having a conversation. And I think it really represented the uniqueness of Brisbane as a place. It's subtropical. We live our lives outdoors for large parts of the year. And we thought, wouldn't it be a fantastic idea if you could translate that idea of canopy and shade and controlled light into the expression of the buildings and the architecture. And certainly the idea of a series of canopies that was unique to place, but had something that tied them together across multiple locations, became a really strong design theme on the project.
Dan, yeah.
I'm just loving these 2 examples, the sort of edge of the buildings and not treating them as an object, and the intimate spaces that have been created, and the tree condition. We worked on a project with Judy Watson in Sydney, 300 George Street, and she was looking at creating an artwork for the lobby of the building. But I suppose the building became this permeable object, and her artwork started in the exterior space and moved through to the central lift wells. She skinned the lift wells in sandstone that were quarried from the site of the building. And during the excavation, Indigenous objects and colonial objects were found together in the base of the building. Judy Watson's an Indigenous artist, and she told the story of that place, which was connected to the tank stream that runs under Sydney, and she gathered some of those objects and displayed them, and then interpreted this sort of mix of colonial and Indigenous history together in this place. And it was a beautiful, very real connection to that place, and that idea of creating these, again, intimate moments and touch points for people to understand, this place where they are. Really nice connections, I think, and sort of linking with what you 2 were just talking about.
We think about many of the project types that you've all been describing. If we go back 50 years, they didn't have this level of scrutiny. They didn't have this integration of the sense of place, the nature of the origin of the site, the materiality you've just described there, Dan. They were really functional places. I mean, I grew up in Sydney, where the Sydney Cricket Ground is strong in my mind, but virtually nothing of it is left that I can recall, perhaps the member stand, which I wasn't allowed into. But the nature of these places are very important in our cities, and I suppose our feeling of how we live in wherever we are. But the role of your work, particularly, Dan, I think it's been interesting to see how that has emerged with a lot of energy in the last decade. I mean, 27 years that you say you've had urban art projects going, which I didn't realise it was that long, and I know you pretty well as a business. But just talk us through a little about the way the scale of projects and the way you've been able to engage with them has changed over the last 10 or so years.
I think, the business certainly has changed remarkably, and the commissioning intent of clients has also changed a lot. There's a much greater appreciation in the architecture and design industries for public space and public realm. There's a lot more investment in that because it's important as our cities grow to create livable cities for our population, for the population and for the citizens. And so art plays a very important role in public space, in city making. And even marketeers have got onto the bandwagon. This idea of destination art. Anish Kapoor's Cloudgate in Chicago was that big driver. It rebranded a city. So Chicago became this destination because of this exquisite artwork that was created for that place. Ugo Rondinone's Seven Magic Mountains installation 10 miles out of Las Vegas has also helped rebrand that city as a cultural destination, not just a gambling mecca. I think
Bilbao, I suppose, is the great...
Yes.
the one everybody recognises.
The Guggenheim, yeah, exactly, is another. I think the Park Conservancy model, again in the US, is local communities managing their own public spaces and having activation programs. So I did a Churchill scholarship to visit a lot of these places, and they're very driven by community. They engage community. They have public art programs, temporary public art programs that cycle through the city. We just completed Messengers of Brisbane for Brisbane Festival, which was an installation of 6 inflatable finches by a European artist, Florentine Hoffmann. And his brief was to, create works that were joyful, sophisticated and sort of inspired connected to people of all ages. And so these inflatable finches all had party hats on. Hoffmann has 4 young children. He understands connection to people and place. I think everyone would know his rubber duck that toured 20 or 30 cities around the world in the last 15 years. So he understands audience and large audiences. So I think I'm probably strayed a little bit from your question, but there's many sectors of society that are seeing value in commissioning artists for work, from tourism to small city councils. So you're getting opportunities to commission artists at all scales, and whether they're temporary or permanent installations or digital, the opportunities are growing. And I'm sure the same can be said about how architecture is being delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the expectation from the end user, Malcolm, has really changed significantly as well over that time frame. And, just the time where public transport and streets was just about getting from A to B, that's, truly gone. And we actually undertook some research whenever we were going through the tender process with Cross River Rail around profiling of users in Brisbane. It was really interesting what came out of that process. And, we found that 70% of millennials would rather spend their money on an experience rather than a possession. And that really started to shift our thinking around how we were going to engage and integrate with the city. And the other interesting piece of research was around the user profile of public transport in Brisbane and how that's different from other parts of Australia and internationally, where the bell curve that you would traditionally see very high with younger age groups was the opposite in Brisbane. The most people using transport locally here are actually in the age bracket from 40 to 60. And the millennial group, the young, hipsters, the university students are not coming in to use public transport. There's so many disruptors now around Uber and other mobility shared facilities that there was actually an emerging problem in terms of long-term patronage growth. So a lot of our work that, we've certainly been doing, and Albert Street's a really great example of, is really carefully thinking about how you orchestrate the experience of these major projects to encourage that young demographic to come out and actually use the facility so that the spaces around the stations are actually, they're very active. They're really a part of this city. They offer a whole raft of experiences that you weren't getting with projects a number of years ago.
So there was a mention there earlier, Dan, about digital art. Perhaps we could just go down the technology exploration a little. The change of technology generally, how has it impacted major projects? Has it made them easier for you to, you have fantastic kind of visuals now in Stadia that 10 years ago really just weren't there. Can we just explore that one a little?
Yeah, it's a great point, Malcolm, and it's actually a wonderful time to be involved in these projects because of the opportunities that technology actually opens up. I think we've got an image of Kuala Lumpur, the stadium in KL there. Here's a simple example where what we can now do with lighting on a facade is incredibly impressive and interesting. And what was interesting about this was repurposing an old stadium, giving it a new life and creating some density and intensity in the surrounding area where we had not just sport, we had living, we had working, we had sport, we had the whole range of the city coming together. And so technology enabled us to give it an identity. And so the idea of identity on these buildings is often very important. Sport and entertainment is a celebration. People are there to have a good time. And that's a wonderful opportunity to actually make a connection because people are open to the stories, they're open to the artwork, they're open to the history. And so technology is allowing us to do that much more. Traditionally, it was, let's just think about a sign on a building, whereas now what we think about is that building is a sign. And so it's an entirely different approach to signage as an interactive component of the journey. And ICC, I think we have an image in Sydney, a similar thing on the arena part of that project. This was a very complex project that we did with our colleagues at Hassell's in a treasured urban part of Sydney, and how we brought what are three very large components of buildings together to resonate. Technology helped us along the way. On the theatre, the left-hand building there, the entrance is actually through a sign. And so we're now able to use wall surfaces as the integrated piece of technology that enables that experience to change, because it comes back to the earlier point. These facilities are never static. And so to some degree, they're a canvas to allow them to evolve over time. And the really beautiful thing about technology is what it is allowing us to do visually to change over time.
Dan, I know you've got a few robots out in your big sheds, which you're training to do things. Let's hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think we are, and this is part of our One Earth strategy, which is about, changing our business from a fairly industrial manufacturer to a much more sustainable business for the future. We're one of the largest art manufacturers in the world. We have 3 workshops in Australia, Shanghai and New York, and we have 300 staff and we deliver projects throughout the world. So, we feel a responsibility, and our clients are already pushing us and the artists we work with to deliver more sustainable outcomes for them. So the robotics program is about onshoring work in Australia, doing things that we may have sent offshore before, so we can be more competitive in our processes. Each robot we've put in, we've got 2 robots. We've employed more people. Between 6 and 8 people get employed when we put a robot in, rather than them taking away jobs, which might be the initial thought people have. They're actually great employers. We've got a team of great people from QUT embedded in our studio, helping us program the robots. But they're helping us make great work here in Australia, and we will. This is a test site for us, and we'll roll the program out in the US and China.
That's fascinating. Keith, how does technology impact it, apart from, making more sophisticated tunnel boring machines? What's the underpinning technology that you think's changed in your area?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a few layers to that, Malcolm, actually, and there's no doubt that, the way that virtual reality and BIM software is used now has brought a fundamental shift to how you can actually design and review parts of projects with, stakeholders. We're delivering 300 metre long platform caverns below ground. They're 25 metres below ground, and taking people, customers, clients through those spaces and down into that environment. It's very complex and it's very unfamiliar to users within Brisbane. We actually developed this fantastic VR model of those underground spaces that now actually allows you to take multiple people into the model at any one time. So, we were standing in a room with probably 15 stakeholders, and we had 5 of those people in a model at one time, actually walking through and experiencing a space that we were designing that's 25 metres below ground. And again, that kind of technology just wasn't available a number of years ago. I think the other really important part of technology from our perspective is the emerging technologies as well, around sharing of information, around timetabling, operations of trains, and how you actually control that gate line and that interface into the station. I think we'll probably see in 5 to 10 years where gate lines will disappear completely. The aviation industry is really leading the way in terms of breaking down those barriers on how you transition through spaces, where there's a project in Heathrow at the moment, pre-COVID granted, that was actually trialling the scanning, full body scans and baggage scans without having to stop. So people were walking through a 25 metre long tunnel, and by the time you got to the end of it, you were completely scanned and free to move through the facility. And I think we'll see a lot of that kind of technology coming into station design, where the gate lines will disappear, and I think that transition from an internal space to an external space will actually become much more seamless in the future.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Years ago, I came to Brisbane in 1981, and soon after that, the domestic airport terminal was re-established with a splendid building, really, a very, very well thought through and a strong conceptual building. And almost from the day it opened, they've changed it. And the technology's changed, the planes have changed, the nature of aviation has changed, and that building has been able to continue to adapt to that changing world. How much longer? Well, of course, it's a very much changed world again now. But the issue, I wanted to head this into the political bureaucratic area. Over time, people don't realise, for instance, that the Brisbane Airport decision was made by Bjelke-Petersen government in association with Gough Whitlam. Now, that would be an unusual partnership normally, but I guess from both points of view, there was a long-term strategy agreed for whatever reasons that was a site and that a new facility, which has proven to be a very important facility for the city. But if we think about the political and bureaucratic setting of these big projects, how do you go about strategising the best way? Because there are always times in a long project when a sudden decision is going to be made, and you need to be, I suppose, ready for it and able to respond when the real pressure's on. Paul, you want to lead off on that?
Yeah, Malcolm, because this is an interesting one when it comes to the Olympics. Having a hard deadline is actually a wonderful thing for large projects because they do take such time and gestation that to have a deadline to work to forces everyone to really think with clarity about the pathway through it. So understanding the journey through decision making and journey through the bureaucratic process is really important. In terms of the Olympics, understanding how the bid process works and what benefit that offers cities is actually a really critical part of it. In London's case, the work we did on the London Olympic Master Plan was about regeneration. And so it became a story that was much more than the Olympics. And I think that's one of the key successful components is that these pieces of social infrastructure have to resonate at more than one level. They have to resonate at lots of levels. It then makes the political decision making much clearer. Generally, these are good news stories. These are projects that look after people, give people a good time, a social connection, that desire to be together. And so even during very hard times, we've seen these projects actually pull folks politically together because the outcomes are just so positive. But having a clarity on what can be a 10-year journey is a critical part of having a great result.
Keith, you've talked about going back, how many years was it at the beginning? 14?
Yeah, well, 2005. Yeah, we started that first discussion. And, I totally agree with what's just been said, actually, where Cross River Rail is another great example of where the fundamental reason that project came about was because of the Murrayvale Bridge and the transition into Roma Street. So it was a capacity issue about getting people into the CBD. But what's actually being delivered from that project is so much further beyond that, and it really has captured, the hearts and minds of everyone involved with it, where it's about economic growth and stimulus for the region. It's about redefining new places within the city and regenerating a lot of those areas that really needed that investment into it. And, whenever that happens with a project, it really does carry it through those multiple political cycles that can create some quite significant speed bumps for projects.
Dan, do you find politics troublesome on occasions?
Not, we're not. We're in a different space, I suppose, slightly. But I think we, talking about the Rio project before, we're seeing political action in that country driving social and cultural change, and that's moving throughout the city of Riyadh and throughout the country, in fact. But what used to be a very private way of living and public space was not promoted or encouraged. You're seeing a huge change in that space. You're seeing mass transport being implemented, and so you're seeing women and men travel together. The political systems are changing radically. So it's great to see that influence being so positively rolled out in those cities.
You made a comment earlier about world, I think, was it you, Paul? A world international kind of design standard rather than an individual one. And individually, you've got your own quite targeted projects, but collaboratively, I would imagine there are occasions when all of you are working together in your, literally on a combined project. The notion of individuality in an international setting, I think, is perhaps the last topic we might explore before we run out of time. But what is it that enables these big projects to create more than just the facility that they are ostensibly solving a problem for, but they're really making cities much more engaged and perhaps more successful places?
These projects are trying to solve social issues, and that's the most important thing, being very clear about what the social issues are. So in Hong Kong, it was about participation in sport, it was about elite sport, and it was about international events. So having that clarity of what socially are we trying to achieve out of the project is so important. And in fact, it's worth just noting on that, when you think in Hong Kong, riots all of last year, COVID this year, a lot of troubles, but this project was seen as a really important social piece of infrastructure and ultimately good news for the community. And so it's actually made its way through all of those conditions relatively unscathed. And so I think that's really important, is understanding what those community outcomes actually are. And then the design response, and certainly the building design response, follows from that. And so we're trying to create ultimately social experiences rather than necessarily an object. And I think with that frame of mind, you can navigate your way through what are incredibly complex, long projects.
Dan, the Riyadh example I think is particularly interesting, perhaps for our audience. Might just unpack that a little more about just what did that project entail, because you don't often hear about Australian designers and consultants working in places like Saudi. Not easy to access, culturally very different. You've succeeded in doing that. How has that come about?
I think so the Riyadh project, we've been working in Saudi since 2007, so for almost 15 years. And the Riyadh project came through a tender we submitted on, but we had worked with the client before. I think Saudi gets a lot of bad press in the West about their political system and structures. But on the ground, the country is going through phenomenal change, and it's one of the most exciting places to work. The consultants that we're working with and the Saudi clients are young and ambitious and unafraid, and are pushing every button they can to change and adapt their society for a new Saudi. There's an artist that we've worked with that says she feels like she's floating above the ground because things are changing so fast. And to quote a more conservative voice, this town planner was asked how he felt about the changes, and he said they're happening so quickly we can't mount any arguments against them. So in Riyadh, our experience was this city that's coming alive, that it's changing so rapidly. So it's an exciting place to be, and I think when you are working in cultures and can be sort of involved in social change, or our work too is all about the benefits and creating great spaces for people to live in, to work in, to socialise in. They're great ways to get to know a country and a people, and Riyadh is a very exciting place. It's like China was 20 years ago, probably. That energy and excitement about change and potential.
Keith, you going to do the same for Brisbane?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think just listening to the conversation, for me, it's really about strategic leadership, I think, across all levels, right from within our project teams, right through to the highest level within, governments and our client groups. Or when you've got someone who's actually visionary around what they want to achieve and they drive that culture from the top, it's actually really, really easy to then everyone to align in behind that. And I think, certainly the examples of the projects that we've worked on, when you have that champion within a client group that leads everyone to an aligned outcome, the benefits in the long term, outcomes are much, much higher quality, and there's a much greater dividend from the investment.
Well, look, I think we're just about out of time. I started off and made some comments about these are complex projects, and I think you've really illustrated the complexity of place and setting and cultures that these projects are involved with. Clearly, you're all very patient designers, because these are long-term, slow projects. We didn't quite get to unpack budget, perhaps at another time, but we do know that they aren't unlimited. We've touched a little on the politics and the process, but really the common theme for me has been about changing in a positive way through scale and considerable engagement. These projects are really important city building projects. They do have big budgets, they involve a lot of people, they employ a lot of people, and you have to get them right. You can't afford to spend this amount of time and energy and end up with something that's not going to give the city the best it can have, because it's very hard to undo these things, as we witnessed with the Roma Street Transit Centre finally coming down. I remember it being built. I remember the Lord Mayor at the time, Sally Ann Atkinson, describing it as an act of aggression against the city. And, it's been there for quite some time, but the opportunity is there for a much better city on that site. So, look, thank you each for giving us the time today. And I will say it's great to see Brisbane, the home for 3 locals, working all over the world, and that's exciting for this city to have that talent here. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.